Thomas Andrews was born in 1873 in Comber, Northern Ireland. Today he is known as the man who built the Titanic, and he has become all but a legend. He features prominently in nearly every film that tells the story of the ship, and we're all familiar with the mythological version of his tale. But the true story of Thomas Andrews is the story of a gentleman, an Irishman, a hard worker, a fair employer, and above all else, a family man. A man who didn't want to leave his home or his family, and he yearned for them relentlessly as fate drew them further and further apart.
Thomas Andrews' role in the construction of the Titanic is very often misunderstood today. If you watch the movies and even some programs about the disaster, you could really be forgiven for coming away with the impression that Andrews designed the ships himself alone, or indeed maybe that he built them all by himself. Andrews was really just one man in a team of experts who designed and built the Olympic-class ships. Andrews had joined Harland Wolff in 1889 as a premium apprentice. After his 5-year apprenticeship, he quickly rose to supervise construction of a number of smaller liners in the mid-1890s and then to oversee the repair department of the firm. Then in 1901, while the company was building the first of the so-called Big Four White Star liners, the Celtic, Andrews became the assistant shipyard manager. Before the year was out, he was appointed manager of construction work. In 1904, he became assistant chief designer, and the year after that, he became the chief of the design department, working directly under Lord Peary. In 1907, he was simultaneously made one of the managing directors of the firm. But all of this training and experience and expertise, what it did is it put him in a position to be a key figure in the design and construction of Olympic and Titanic. And yet there were other people. Particularly important in the design of the Olympic-class ships were two relatives of Andrews, his uncle, William Peary, who ran the shipyard, and his uncle's brother-in-law by marriage, Alexander Carlisle. In all truth, Lord Peary himself oversaw and had a firm hand in the design and the details of all of the ships that his company built. And Carlisle worked at his right hand in bringing all Harland Wolff ships, including Olympic and Titanic, to a finished design. When Carlisle retired from Harland Wolff in June 1910, it was only a few months before the Olympic was launched, and Titanic's construction was already well underway. Even though Andrews took Carlisle's place and became Peary's right-hand man at that point, picking up where Carlisle had left off, by then the primary designs of the Olympic and Titanic had already been finished. So while it's clear that Andrews had assisted in the process of bringing the two sisters' designs into a finished form, the reality is that Peary and Carlisle were more directly involved in heading up the actual design, the details, decorations, equipment, and the general arrangements of the ships. Furthermore, White Star's own Bruce Ismay worked very closely with Peary and Carlisle on many details of the ships. Andrews was a key figure, and the role he played should never be diminished, it should never be minimized, but neither should it be blown out of proportion. Because his uncle was Lord Peary, chairman of the shipyard, initially one might assume that Andrews was kind of riding the family coattails. It couldn't be further from the truth. Andrews is known to have loved the famous quote that what we think, or what we know, or what we believe is in the end of little consequence. The only thing of consequence is what we do. And really his co-workers at the yard could well attest to the fact that he lived by that principle.
His friends and family said that he was also very even in his nature. He loved people, always tried to cheer them up, encourage them, always giving a smile and then a nod or a pat on the back. There were reports that in the shipyard, where the work was very dangerous, if he caught someone either loafing around or being careless, he could give them a tongue lashing over it. However, this was really based on the fact that Andrews cared about people and their safety. Indeed, whereas many bosses would simply fire someone on the spot, Andrews was known to usually give them that sort of stern warning and then look for improvement.
Beyond that, Andrews was really a keen listener. He was well known to settle disputes between workers in the yard or even crew members of the ships that he built, many of whom knew him personally and were extremely fond of him. He listened to the input from even the lowliest workers on the ships about their quarters and how they could be improved, things like that. Andrews was always taking in that input. He was listening to it. He was applying it to make the ships that he built better and more comfortable, more practical for those who worked on or who traveled on his ships.
Andrews was married to Helen Riley Barber on the 24th of June, 1908. And after their honeymoon, they moved into Dunallen House at 12 Windsor Avenue in South Belfast, just a few blocks from Queen's University. And their daughter, Elizabeth, was born on the 27th of November, 1910.
Andrews really wasn't a typical master, as people in positions of authority were often called at that time. And it seemed that he genuinely cared about the men who worked in the shipyard. His wife later recalled a couple of occasions when they were out in the yard in the evening as the thousands of workers were all leaving work, and he reportedly said to her, "There go my pals, Nellie." And she recalled that it seemed that they were as dear to him as if they were his own family members. The rumor mill seemed to indicate that Thomas Andrews was very much in line to head up the Harland Wolff shipyard after Peary retired.
Following Thomas Andrews around the Harland Wolff shipyard, particularly during the construction of the Olympic and Titanic, was said to be an astonishingly exhausting experience. He seemed to be just about everywhere all the time, moving from one area of the yard to another. This physical activity was in spite of the fact that he had varicose veins, and no doubt was very stiff and sore at the end of a workday. The situation with his health had developed so fiercely that the crew of the Olympic who knew him had actually chipped in and bought him a magnificent walking stick, which they presented to him in June 1911 on the Olympic's maiden voyage. The morning breeze whipped through the valley as the sun rose on Dunallen House on the morning of April 1st, 1912. Dunallen was at 12 Windsor Avenue, a beautiful two-story brick house with a staircase in the middle reminiscent of the R.M.S. Titanic. On the middle landing of the stairs were beautiful stained glass windows which let the morning sunshine come in. Andrews' driver was waiting out front with the family's Renault motor car as Thomas stepped outside. To his right, he would have seen Davis Mountain and heard the birds chirping in the cool morning. Helen very likely would have come out with him, carrying their daughter, to kiss him goodbye. They expected that they would be seeing him again in about a month's time when the Titanic returned from New York.
Titanic sea trials were scheduled for the morning of Monday, the 1st of April, 1912, but because of high winds, it was decided that trying to maneuver the enormous ship in the narrow waters of the Belfast Lock was not a very good idea. So the event was postponed by a day.
And we don't know if Andrews actually had the opportunity to return to his home for one last night, or if he spent that night at the shipyard, in his offices, or perhaps even aboard his new ship.
Happily, the weather was a marked improvement on the next morning, and the trials could proceed as planned. He actually represented the firm during the trial trip, heading up the builder's delegation. There were a lot of workmen and senior Harland Wolff personnel who were also on board. Among these were Edward Wilding, who was Andrews' right-hand man, and the individuals who comprised the so-called guarantee group. This was a crack team of 9 men who were hand-picked to represent various departments of the Harland Wolff shipyard during the round-trip maiden voyage. They were on board to ensure that everything was in tip-top shape and met or exceeded expectations. Now, throughout the day, Andrews was very busy receiving representatives of the owners, White Star, and he was also engaged in inspecting and superintending the work of completing Titanic, really taking notes on anything and everything. In spite of how much was going on that day, that afternoon or evening, Andrews took a moment to dash off a quick letter to his wife, and he wrote, "Just a line to let you know that we got away this morning in fine style, and have had a very satisfactory trial. We are getting more shipshape every hour, but there is still a great deal to be done." That evening, Titanic returned to the Belfast Lock at about 6 o'clock, arriving in Belfast proper about an hour later. The ship had passed her tests with flying colors. Her passenger certificate was signed. It was good for 1 year, and she was formally handed over to the White Star Line. Everyone who wasn't proceeding to Southampton disembarked, and items that were required to finish the ship were brought on board. This included galley requisites, cooking apparatus, some chairs, and things like that. By about 8 o'clock that night, Titanic left her birthplace for the last time, bound for Southampton.
Through that night and all the next day, Titanic steamed toward her new home port on what later became termed as the delivery trip. But there was very little rest to be had on board, for Titanic was still very much incomplete when she'd left Belfast, and there was only 1 week until she sailed on her maiden voyage. During all of Wednesday the 3rd of April, as Titanic steamed south through the Irish Sea, Andrews was, quote, ceaselessly employed going round with representatives of the owners and of the firm in taking notes and preparing reports of work still to be done, end quote. Wilding had also stayed aboard for the trip to Southampton and later recalled that there were electrical trials, tests involving sanitary arrangements, and so forth. He said that they tested and tried everything in the ship and that there were a good many things to try. Saloon steward Frederick D. Ray, who stayed on through the maiden voyage, recalled that he was assigned to wait on Andrews's table during the delivery trip. Ray, like many of the crew on Titanic, knew Andrews very well and had served him before while both men were aboard the Olympic.
Now, even though Third Officer Pittman later recalled that the ship had reached Southampton and tied up at midnight on the night of the 3rd to the 4th of April, we can actually do a little bit better than Pittman's estimation. According to the official harbor pilot logbooks, Titanic tied up at Southampton's berth 44, White Star Dock, at 1:15 a.m. on the 4th of April, and this would have been after a trip of about 570 miles.
Titanic sat in Southampton at White Star Dock, later known as Ocean Dock, berth 44, for just less than a week before her scheduled departure. Now, just because her engines were idle doesn't mean that her crew, and indeed her builders, were idle too. Andrews was up early every morning and boarding the ship before dawn, and he stayed aboard well after dark.
Now, for everyone that was connected with Titanic, the stay in Southampton, it was not a relaxing one, and there was a lot of work to do to finish the ship. But hard work was something that Andrews was very familiar with. During the Titanic's time in port, he stayed at the Southwestern Hotel, which was right there by the White Star Dock. It was conveniently located close to both the ship and to the local offices of Harland Wolff, which Andrews was going to be visiting every single day.
The Southwestern Hotel was a beautiful and massive hotel built in the French Renaissance style in 1872 and acquired by the London and Southwestern Railway. Many of Titanic's passengers stayed here prior to the voyage, including J. Bruce Ismay. No doubt, in Andrews's hotel room, he had plans and notes sprawled across every surface, as he later would in his stateroom aboard the Titanic. The Southwestern Hotel still stands today and is used as flats.
Early on the morning of Thursday, 4th of April, Andrews was up and spending time with managers and foremen to get the work organized and underway. That evening, he wrote to his wife, "I wired you this morning of our safe arrival after a very satisfactory trip. The weather was good and everyone most pleasant. I think the ship will clean up all right before sailing on Wednesday." He also mentioned that the doctors had refused to allow Lord Peary to make the maiden voyage. In this note, Andrews was rather optimistic, but there remained a lot of work left to do. Furniture and fittings had to be put in place. Many spaces still needed to be painted. Carpet was still being installed in the passenger staterooms throughout the trip down to Southampton and during the following week. Most of the ship's china, glassware, and cutlery were not brought on board until the stay in Southampton. Some of the staterooms remained unfinished. Some second-class sections weren't furnished, including some of the lavatories, and one of these crates of fixtures were sitting about waiting to be installed. And all of this work was on top of the typical work of preparing a ship for a round-trip voyage to New York and back.
On every day of the stay in Southampton, Andrews was always busy, taking owners around the ship, interviewing engineers, officials, agents, managers, subcontractors, and the like, superintending the work of completing the Titanic. His secretary, Thompson Hamilton, said that Andrews was never for a moment idle. He generally left his hotel about 8:30 for the offices, which were in the dockyards, where he dealt with his correspondence, and then went on aboard until 6:30. when he would return to the offices to sign letters. Hamilton added, probably from personal observation, that Andrews was a hands-on sort of man. He would put tables, chairs, berth ladders, racks, electric fans all in place by himself. Hamilton later added that, excepting when he saw everything absolutely perfect, Andrews was never satisfied. Over the days spent in Southampton, it really was touch and go. On the 7th of April, her new chief officer, Henry Wilde, wrote home that he was working very hard along with the crew to get the ship ready to sail, and even at the late time, he noted that she was very far behind. On the day before sailing, former Second Officer David Blair took his sister on board for a tour, and she recalled the ship was a hive of activity, with carpets being laid and decorators hard at work. A lot of paintwork was still going on, and a strong chemical smell permeated the ship. In fact, the day before sailing, a last-minute order was called in for a local florist in Southampton, who brought aboard all sorts of flowers and greeneries for the trip. Now, these flowers were apparently part of an effort to mask the smell of the paint.
Yet through hard work, things eventually came together, and Titanic was ready to sail on the morning of Wednesday, 10th of April, as scheduled. There were some more odds and ends to settle up after departing, but these were more details as opposed to serious work. On the evening of Tuesday, 9th of April, Andrews wrote home to his wife. The Titanic is now about complete, and will, I think, do the old firm credit tomorrow when we sail.
Wednesday, the 10th of April, 1912, and in Southampton, it's sailing day for the Titanic. Captain Smith was aboard the ship at 7:30 a.m., but Thomas Andrews had him beat by an hour and a half, coming aboard at 6.
We know that Andrews took one last long inspection of the ship from bow to stern that morning. He was reportedly very pleased with her, and just before the ship cast off, he said goodbye to his secretary, Mr. Hamilton, who recalled that Andrews seemed to be in excellent health and spirits. Andrews' last words to Hamilton were, "Remember now and keep Mrs. Andrews informed of any news of the vessel."
Andrews was booked in stateroom A36, which was on the port side of the aft grand staircase, just forward of the first-class smoking room. This and its counterpart on the starboard side of the entrance, A37, were new staterooms only found aboard the Titanic at the time. The 3-berth room was rendered in Harland Wolff's own bedroom B style, and had its own private bath, something of a novelty for even the finest first-class staterooms on board the Titanic. Stewardess Violet Jessup later recalled that the stokers and trimmers, the humblest men in Titanic's crew, had actually invited Andrews down to their quarters. Now, we don't know if this invitation was while he was still doing the pre-departure inspections in Southampton, or if the ship was already en route to Cherbourg, but we do know that these men, who had worked aboard the Olympic, had given suggestions to Andrews and Harland Wolff on how their quarters could be improved aboard the Titanic based on what they saw on the Olympic. And they were surprised, and indeed took it as a significant compliment, when Andrews not only took their suggestions, but incorporated them into the design of the new ship. And as Violet Jessup later recalled, his gentle face lit up with real pleasure to be thanked in such a way.
Titanic cast off from her berth shortly after noon, and was quickly almost caught up in a near disaster. We don't have all of Andrews' thoughts regarding the near collision with the New York as Titanic was leaving her berth and moving down the River Test, but we do know that he wrote in a letter that evening that the situation had been, quote, decidedly unpleasant. Now, after everything that Andrews and the Harland Wolff personnel had gone through in repairing Olympic after her collision with the Hawk the previous autumn, one can only imagine that Andrews must have been envisioning a repeat performance on Titanic's maiden voyage as this scene was playing out, along with all the ignominy that would bring with it.
As dusk approached that evening, Titanic steamed into Cherbourg, France. In the last light of the twilight, Andrews looked down from the Titanic's deck onto the tenders Nomadic and Traffic. These tenders were bringing passengers and baggage and mail out from the Cherbourg docks to the Titanic. He was rightfully proud of them, as he had built them about a year prior. That night, Andrews once more wrote home to his wife. "We reached here in nice time and took on board quite a number of passengers. The 2 little tenders looked very well. You will remember we built them about a year ago. We expect to arrive at Queenstown about 10:30 a.m. tomorrow. The weather is fine, and everything is shaping for a good voyage. He added that he had a seat at the table of the ship's surgeon, Dr. O'Loughlin, an old friend of his. When Titanic stopped at Queenstown, he sent home that one last letter to his wife, in which he told her that everything on board was going splendidly and that he was pleased to have received so much kindness from everybody. During the crossing, Andrews' pride in the Titanic was apparent. His table companions, Mr. and Mrs. Albert Dick of Canada, had come to love his character and saw his pride in the accomplishments of his company. However, they also remember him talking constantly about his wife, his daughter, his family, and his home. On Friday evening, April 12th, Andrews bumped into stewardess Mary Sloane and stopped to talk to her. She was from Belfast as well, and they had been acquainted for some time. She remembered that it was always good to hear his laugh and have him near you, and that he made you feel on the ship that all was right. There was always a smile, a nod, or a hearty word no matter what he was in the middle of. However, she also noticed that as they talked and as Dr. O'Loughlin was on the stairs constantly calling back Tommy so as to hurry him up so that the two of them could go eat, Andrews seemed preoccupied. She said that he, quote, seemed loath to go. He wanted to stay and talk about home. He was telling me how his father was ill and Mrs. Andrews was not well. She was congratulating him on the Titanic, but he confided in her that the thing he did not like about the Titanic was that it was taking him further from home every minute. She thought his face had a very grave expression, and she recalled that throughout the crossing, between laughs and smiles, his face would suddenly fall grave, and he would glance over his shoulder, as if looking back towards home. It seems that he had left his heart behind in Ireland. Because this was not the first ship that Harland Wolff, and indeed Andrews himself, had delivered to the White Star Line, this was not Thomas's first maiden voyage crossing. And because Titanic's crew were hand-picked from other White Star Line ships, they all knew and loved Thomas Andrews. Chief Baker Charles Yelkin had a special tradition of baking a loaf of Irish soda bread every voyage that Andrews was on, to be delivered to his cabin as soon as Ireland disappeared over the horizon to help him with his homesickness. Andrews was clearly tired, and considering the breakneck pace of the work in finishing the ship, he had good reason to feel that way. Andrews wasn't a complainer though. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it to the fullest. On the 11th of April, 2 passengers recalled that workmen were still installing the doors in the first-class Café Parisien on B deck. There were also some problems with this ship, minor in the overall scheme, but certainly they would have been irritating to the detail-oriented Andrews. Too many screws in the coat hooks. The hot press in the galley was not working right. Worse, however, plumbing was not fully installed in one of the second-class lavatories. The heating was not reaching some of the cabins in the lower decks. These were jobs for him and his guarantee group to fix, and important notes to improve the design of the third and final Olympic-class liner, the Britannic, which he was overseeing the construction of as well back home. Titanic was woefully behind schedule, and Andrews knew this. On the 11th at dinner time, this was the topic of conversation that Andrews brought up with his fellow passengers while dining at the purser's table. His cabin steward was Henry Etches, who recalled seeing Andrews wake up early and get right to work and be out working aboard the ship very late. He spent most of his time working on E deck, more than anywhere else for some reason, but he also had schematics and notes and plans of the ship scattered all about his cabin. He also recalled that whenever Andrews went down into the engineering spaces, he would don a blue surveyor suit so as to protect his good clothes from getting oil or coal stained. Stewardess Violet Jessup remembered just how busy he was, but he would always stop for a cheery conversation with her. The only thing bringing him down, she said, was that they were getting further from home. However, by dinner on April the 14th, Andrews was in a much brighter mood. In fact, stewardess Mary Sloane even went so far as to say that he looked splendid. After dinner, Andrews went to the ship's bakery to pick up another loaf of Irish soda bread before returning to his cabin quite later to review the notes from his day. It had become significantly colder as the ship had recently entered the Labrador Current. He sat at his desk in his cabin, likely hearing the sound of distant chatter winding down, drowned out by the beating of the engines and the soft hum of the heater behind him. At 11:40 that night, those engines stopped, which didn't go unnoticed by him.
Andrews emerged from his cabin very shortly after the collision. first moving through the aft grand staircase entrance just outside his stateroom on A deck. Then he went out onto the promenade and he walked forward, and he was obviously in search of answers about what had disrupted the rhythm of the ship's operation. When Titanic struck the iceberg, chunks of ice had rained down onto the ship's forward well deck, and this really became the center of attention for many of the ship's passengers within the first few minutes of the collision. First-class passengers Eleanor Casimir and Harry Anderson, they stood at the forward end of A deck, looking down onto the ice and discussing what had happened when Thomas Andrews joined them. Now, this is the first confirmed sighting of Thomas Andrews in the chronology of the sinking, and it's very significant because it indicates that Andrews was already up and about. He was aware of the damage before any one of the ship's crew could have had the time to go and summon him from his cabin. Clearly, he knew that something was up, and before he was told, he was already on the deck investigating. Casimir and Anderson were able to see the iceberg in the distance from where they were standing, so it's almost certain that Andrews also saw it as it faded into the darkness astern. Casimir and Anderson expressed their concerns about the situation to Andrews, but Andrews reassured them that Titanic was absolutely safe. And he reiterated that even if the ship were to break into 3 parts, she still wouldn't founder. Quite likely, he was also attempting to reassure himself, even as he began his inspections of the ship, leaving the passengers on A deck behind. Now, from the forward promenade of A deck, it's very difficult to say where Andrews went next. The stairs just near there led up to the vicinity of the bridge, so the question would be, did Andrews go up and find Captain Smith at all? We don't know, and there really is no eyewitness evidence on the matter. So it's really possible that Andrews set off on his own to inspect the ship without contacting any of the officers or the captain. Now, clearly he moved aft quickly into the vicinity of the forward grand staircase because he was next spotted there by passengers Albert and Vera Dick, who were Andrews' table companions. When they asked him about the situation, Andrews told them that he was going to go down below and he was going to inspect the damage. Now, the couple, they begged him not to go, but he told them he had to because he knew the ship better than anyone and because he wanted to be able to allay the fears of the passengers. Still, the encounter left the couple feeling both worried and uncertain.
Andrews descended the grand staircase down to E deck, having been seen by saloon steward Johnstone as he passed through the D deck reception room. Johnstone saw Andrews speak to a few first-class ladies and told them that he's sure the ship was safe. Then he entered Scotland Road and moved aft. A few minutes after this, Johnstone would see Captain Smith following the same route, where he eventually met up with Andrews and Chief Engineer Joseph Bell down in the engine room. Johnstone saw Andrews and Smith return a few minutes later and then moved forward to the mailroom in the first-class baggage spaces. From E deck, they were able to look down to F deck and then G deck, seeing that G deck was already awash. The time is now 12:10 a.m. Titanic's postal workers are doing their best to salvage the mail from the lower level of the 2-story post office complex. They believe the ship would eventually equalize and become stable. Stewardess Annie Robinson was in the first-class corridor on E deck when Smith and Andrews emerged from the mail hold and walked past her. She overheard Andrews say, "Well, 3 have gone already, Captain," referring to 3 watertight compartments. A few minutes later, Annie, sensing trouble, glanced down the same steps they came up from. Only a few minutes ago, Johnstone had seen the water on the G deck landing. Now Robinson saw the water had completely overtaken G and F deck. It was now creeping towards E deck, the deck she was on. Smith and Andrews parted ways. After this, Smith returned to the bridge while Andrews continued his inspection tour. Titanic was not yet declared doomed, but enough had been confirmed that it looked very grim. At this point, Smith proactively ordered the passengers up on deck with their lifeboats on, should the worst be confirmed.
There's no eyewitness reports as to where Andrews went next, but he must have gone to boiler rooms 5 and 6. The flooding there confirmed to him that the ship would not survive the night, and this changed his demeanor entirely. He was no longer reassuring people, he was now frantic. At 12:22 a.m., first-class passenger Anna Warren on D deck recalled seeing Andrews running up the grand staircase with a look of terror on his face. Other passengers tried to stop and speak with him, but the bright and cheery man now ignored them. He ran up the staircase 3 steps at a time to the boat deck, apparently on his way to the bridge to speak with the captain. The conversation was brief, and when it was complete at about 12:25 a.m., he had delivered the devastating and unthinkable news.
He reported the dire news, estimating that the ship had an hour, perhaps an hour and a half, but not much longer. Unlike in the movies, there's no evidence that there was a conference of the officers when Andrews delivered this devastating news, nor that there was ever a formal announcement to tell them that the ship was doomed. While the officers busied themselves with preparing the lifeboats, Andrews focused his attention on getting the passengers up on deck. He left the bridge, likely in a rush, and moved down to A deck, where he ran into stewardess Annie Robinson once more. He told her to put on her lifebelt and to walk around so passengers would see her wearing it. She objected, saying, quote, "It looks rather mean," to which he responded that if she valued her life, she'd put it on. As the stewards woke passengers, Andrews was seen by several others as he ran about, urging many to get on deck and telling the woman to put on their lifebelts. First-class passenger George Reams recalled Andrews stopping him and his brother-in-law and instructing them to put on their lifebelts as well.
Eventually, Andrews found his own steward, Henry Etches, on B deck, and he asked him to follow him down to C deck. There he gave him specific instructions to make sure the passengers knew where to find their lifebelts. He also told him to make sure that no lifebelts were left behind in cabins after they'd been abandoned. The two separated for a few minutes to muster passengers on C deck and then joined back together before heading back to the vicinity of the grand staircase together. The purser's office, which was at the C deck landing of the grand staircase, was swarmed with passengers at that point, all of whom were desperately trying to get their valuables. Purser McElroy was telling the women there to return to their cabins and to put on their lifebelts. Of course, he was also adding that it was just a preliminary caution. Andrews said, "That's exactly what I have been trying to get them to do." Andrews then continued on his way down to D deck, where he disappeared for a little while, having left Steward Etches to his own devices.
12:40 a.m. Lifeboat number 7 is the first lifeboat to depart the Titanic, and Thomas Andrews is there assisting with the loading, as is White Star Line chairman Bruce Ismay. Once the boat was off, Andrews moved forward to Boat 5 to help more. Eleanor Casimir, who spoke with him earlier in the sinking, recalled seeing Andrews motioning for her to get into the boat, but she couldn't hear what he said over the venting steam from the funnels. When she asked him why he didn't get into the boat as well, he said no, women and children first. With this boat off, Andrews saw that the officers had the evacuation relatively under control, and he returned inside to the passenger accommodations to see if anyone else needed to be urged out onto the deck. Passengers John Thayer and his son Jack were just inside and could hear the music of the ship's musicians playing when they ran into Andrews and asked him how bad the situation truly was. Grimly and quietly, Andrews replied that he did not give the ship much over an hour to live. It seems that from here, Andrews moved aft, perhaps into the smoke room, where the mythology of the Titanic incorrectly places Andrews for the last few minutes of the sinking. He was seen in there before 1:40 a.m. His arms were folded and a lifebelt was on the table near him. The steward said to him, "Aren't you going to try for it, Mr. Andrews?" Stewart said that Andrews didn't respond. He stood there stunned. Now Stewart left and managed to get away in lifeboat 15 at 1:40 a.m.
It does mean that Andrews was in that location over a half an hour before Titanic sank, far earlier than is commonly portrayed. The story showed up early on in Shan Bullock's account of Thomas Andrews' life and death, but what's very interesting is if you read the book, even Bullock did not claim that this was the final sighting of Andrews, as has become so entrenched in the history books. Instead, Bullock pointed out other sightings of Andrews, showing that Andrews was still trying to save lives right up until the very end.
He was seen a few minutes later by one of the officers up on deck. Perhaps the steward's questioning woke him up a little bit. He was seen throwing deck chairs overboard to those struggling in the water, before he walked forward, downhill, carrying his lifebelt towards the bridge.
Stewardess Mary Sloan was very well acquainted with Andrews. She remembered seeing Andrews quite late in the disaster, telling women who were supposedly hesitating to board a lifeboat, "Ladies, you must get in at once. There is not a minute to lose. You cannot pick and choose your boat. Don't hesitate. Get in. Get in." Now, according to Shan Bullock's telling of this story, this statement by Andrews is what actually moved Miss Sloane to leave Titanic, and he placed this event at 2:05 a.m. What's interesting is that Miss Sloane eventually ended up in boat number 12, but we know that's not the boat that she started off in. In fact, other research indicates that she left Titanic either in boat number 4, which lowered away at 1:50 a.m., or collapsible D, which lowered away at 2:05 a.m. But whichever of those two boats she actually left Titanic in, this sighting of Andrews by Miss Sloane during the loading of a later lifeboat, it really is further evidence that the smoking room sighting was not the last place that Andrews was before Titanic sank. It also shows that he was actively involved in helping to save women and children even after he was seen there.
Around 2:10 a.m., steward Cecil Fitzpatrick saw him speaking with Captain Smith on the bridge. Cecil was forward on the port side, and having seen collapsible D launched, crossed through the bridge to get to the starboard side. At that point, despite the bow being down so far, Cecil was still clinging to hope that the ship would stabilize. It came as a total shock to him when he overheard Captain Smith say to Thomas Andrews, "We can't stay any longer. She's going." Cecil Fitzpatrick, after recovering from the shock of overhearing this, which he experienced physically, gathered himself and left the two on the bridge to go and assist in preparing collapsible A.
Only moments later, the bridge submerged. Many eyewitnesses, including junior Marconi operator Harold Bride, saw Smith jump from the bridge as it went under. Fitzpatrick specifically saw Andrews jump with him. Now, we don't know if the two men tried to stay together once they got into the icy water, but we do know that Smith likely swam towards overturned collapsible lifeboat B, but failed to get aboard. Both of these men had families who needed them, especially Andrews, and the small bit of conversation overheard by Cecil Fitzpatrick tells us that these two men were not resigned to their fates in some sort of semi-suicidal state of shock. Although they were both certainly wrestling with the burden of the night's events, they were going to try for it. Now, because Andrews made this last-ditch effort to save himself along with Smith, and cowardice does not seem to be a trait for either of these two men, it's apparent that in this moment, their thoughts were on their families and that they wanted to see them again. Andrews likely died in the water somewhere above where the bridge went under. Now, we don't know if he was crushed by one of the falling funnels, or if he succumbed to the icy cold temperatures like most Titanic's passengers. It's possible that he had passed before the ship had even completely foundered, but one way or another, his body was never found. Thomas Andrews' story was largely ignored by the press in 1912. They wanted to know what happened to the millionaires, the people whose loss would actually impact society as a whole, or what happened to the senior officers of Titanic's crew because they presumed they would have the most exciting stories. But the soft-spoken Irishman who helped give life to the Titanic and then died alongside her was largely overlooked in most places outside of Belfast. It should be said, however, that to those who knew him, his loss had a devastating impact. He left behind a wife and child, and a shipyard of thousands of workers who loved him. Even at the White Star Line, although his life had been turned upside down by the disaster, J. Bruce Ismay took the time to mourn his friend and console his friend's widow.
Ismay actually wrote to Andrews' wife with his condolences, and in the letter he said, I knew your husband for many years and had the highest regard for him and looked upon him as a true friend. No one who had the pleasure of knowing him could fail to realize and appreciate his numerous good qualities, and he will be sadly missed in his profession. Nobody did more for the White Star Line or was more loyal to its interests than your good husband, and I always placed the utmost reliance on his judgment.
David Galloway, a good friend of Andrews, traveled aboard the SS Lapland following the sinking, while it was carrying Titanic's surviving crew members back to England after the U.S. inquiries. He was hoping to find out what happened to his friend, interviewing many survivors, and then sent his findings in a letter to Lord Perry, Andrews' uncle and the president of Harland Wolff. This letter, along with family interviews, were used by a writer named Shan Bullock to put together an excellent biography on Andrews. To this day, the city of Belfast and the Titanic Museum there continue to pay tribute to the man who shaped their city so profoundly, as does the Belfast Titanic Society.
Andrews is a very interesting part of the Titanic story for Belfast. The Titanic story is essentially a story of people who faced adversity and how they coped with that. I like to think that he stands out because he was a leader, not only of the Guarantee Group, but also from the testimony that we've heard, very much so in a way we don't have to look at memorials locally here because he's so very much in the folk memory of the people of Belfast and of the Comber area. Quite a few locations locally here in Belfast and surrounding districts. Of course, Thomas Andrews also studied naval architecture at the Belfast Technical College, and it is still with us also. Fortunately, he's remembered most poignantly in the memorial at Belfast City Hall and the memorial gardens there by the people of the city.
In Comber, County Down, Northern Ireland, a memorial hall was built in Thomas Andrews' name and served as a community center for decades. And this memorial hall is right next to the Andrews Memorial Primary School.
The hall echoes the whole spirit of Thomas Andrews and the Andrews family because it was about giving something back and to be part of the community.
Comber was the town in which Andrews grew up, and after his death, his family kept a large portrait of Thomas hanging on the wall. It's the portrait we've all seen of the man, and the family's copy of it still survives this day in a private collection.
The portrait dates to about 1911, and it is in the original frame. I purchased it at an auction last year. It did hang in the Thomas Andrews family home, where you can imagine after the Titanic disaster, this was a piece of comfort to the family. It was something that his family, his wife, would have looked upon and remembered him by. So it's a very special piece to me, knowing that it was such a personal piece to Thomas Andrews' family.
Andrews' actions during the sinking and his foresight during the construction saved countless lives. We'll never know how many, but he truly was a family man. His flesh and blood family, his shipyard, and his workmates were all family to him. And even though his body was lost in the Atlantic, his heart never left Ireland, nor did Ireland ever forget him.